When we think of space games today, we mostly think of, well, space. Drifting across the cosmos in our starship, dodging asteroids, playing hide and seek in a nebula, and generally just living out the fantasy of having that unshackled freedom to explore the great expanse. But what goes up must come down, and eventually a space sim will need to give the player the opportunity to visit a planet or moon, and this is where the immersion can sometimes fall apart for tons of games. Indeed, many have tried varying takes on this, ranging from truncated set pieces that whisk you from space to ground in the blink of an eye, leaving the rest to the imagination, while others opt for a more sophisticated and immersive gameplay experience that remains unforgettable in many gamers' minds to this day. Star Citizen aims to push this transition between Void to Planet beyond anything we've seen in the game thus far to date through some incredible changes to its flight model coming down the road. Welcome pilots, my name is Hybrid V, and today we'll be talking about one of Star Citizen's smaller yet massively important features coming soon to the game, and that is the inclusion of control surfaces for ships when navigating terrestrial flight across planets and moons. Currently, the progress tracker shows that control surfaces are slowly coming to a close on their schedule. Now, this doesn't mean that they are done or even close to being done. Many factors could still delay the launch of these new control surface mechanics. For example, it may be that CIG are working on this new feature now, but may not actually deploy it until, say, Master Modes comes in, for example, whenever that will be. Until CIG gives us more info on this front, all we can do at this point is speculate when we'll see this in the future. After all, the progress tracker is just the scheduled work for upcoming features, not a promise for when those features will actually be released. Alright, with that caveat aside, let's actually dive in to see what this new aerodynamic control surfaces feature actually is. To quote CIG, aerodynamic control surfaces are described as follows. Ships with control surfaces will be able to use them in atmospheres to aid their maneuverability. This will allow for improved performance from ships that have weak maneuvering thrusters in atmosphere and bring new depth to aerodynamic flight in the game. If you play Star Citizen or just follow the project from afar, you undoubtedly already know that there is already planetary flight in-game. Indeed, the tech for this came in during the release of 3.0 way back in 2017 and early 2018. So the question is, what are these control surfaces and how will it affect how we fly in-game? And more importantly, why are they even bothering to implement this feature in the first place? To get a better understanding of how this will completely change the way we fly on planets and moons, we first need to look at the current flight model for ships in atmosphere to get a better understanding of where this new feature fits in. Currently, when we fly our ships in atmosphere, we mostly stay aloft thanks to our thrusters, which help hold our altitude, especially when hovering. Ships currently do have calculated centers of mass and even simulated lift, but Star Citizen does not utilize a full fluid simulation for its flight model like many other hardcore flight sims do. So most of what we experience is more of a simplified yet believable form of atmospheric flight. However, despite all that, there are some limitations, of course. First and foremost is when you shut off your engines in-game currently, your ship will just begin to sink like a rock. So while there is some simulated lift, it does not hold you up long enough due to the loss of momentum. Eventually you will stall out and crash. And this is mostly because your engines are off, so you have zero control over your craft. Stick input remains dead until you turn the engines back on. You can engage decoupled mode, which keeps the engines on, but ACS, the system that governs thruster output derived from stick input, will no longer attempt to rest your momentum when you let off the throttle. This causes the ship to sink down due to gravity, but still gives the pilot control of the ship since the maneuvering thrusters are still active. Even so, this is still short of simulating actual flight. This is where control surfaces come in. Planes in real life utilize control surfaces to alter the lift characteristics of their flight profile. For example, ailerons are used to help a plane bank, while the vertical stabilizers assist with rudder inputs and stabilization. Additional control surfaces, such as air brakes, trailing edge flaps, and leading edge flaps can further alter the flight characteristics, giving the pilot more control. Star Citizen plans to implement its own form of simulated control surfaces to give pilots more options when flying on a planet or moon. So when you shut off your engines, your ship will no longer sink like a rock with no control. You instead will be able to glide along since your control surfaces will give you the ability to control the flight profile and lift characteristics, allowing you to make heading adjustments, climb, dive, or just maintain current lift vector. There will also be the option to simply disable the maneuvering thrusters and just keep the main engines on along with control surfaces so you can continue to maneuver with forward thrust only. This will make flying on planets for extended periods of time much more economical, since you will no longer be burning all that precious hydrogen fuel to keep yourself aloft while zipping around the planet. However, you can still keep those smaller thrusters on, with the benefit of them working with those control surfaces to assist you with performing some pretty crazy maneuvers that you otherwise could not do with just those control surfaces alone. The main issue with this is that it not only will cost way more fuel to perform these stunts, but you will also run the risk of increasing your heat signature and even possibly cause those thrusters to overheat and wear out faster, as CIG have stated before that they want wear and heat buildup to be a major concern when operating in atmosphere. This might be a bigger problem for larger ships, but smaller ships will still have to balance how much stress they are putting on these smaller thrusters during prolonged engagements. Wearing out your thrusters could cost you way more in the long run if you are not careful. Now, one may ask, what is the purpose of having this in-game when we already have a form of atmospheric flight to begin with? Is it not enough that we can already fly just fine now? The reason for this is to add additional believability and mechanical depth to the flight model when transitioning from space to atmosphere. And on a tactical level, it can give pilots more options to work with when both operating out on long-range patrols or when they're just trying to slip by enemy radar by having those engines go cold, keeping their SIGs low. CIG is always striving to push combat more into that World War II feeling of action, where opponents are much closer and much slower, leading to intense action scenes. Indeed, this was the inspiration behind Star Wars' combat dogfight scenes, where they referenced real World War II gun camp footage to build out their epic dogfight scenes. This ended up keeping the action more readable and engaging for the viewer, and that is exactly what these control surfaces will seek to accomplish for atmospheric flight. You see, one big problem that the current flight model has from a mechanics and aesthetic perspective is that ships can sometimes look like floating balloons when flying or hovering in atmosphere, as well as they can perform some pretty crazy stunts that normal planes just cannot pull off thanks to their thrusters, giving them the ability to vector in insane ways. This is also partly because of how forgiving G-forces are on pilots currently, but also because we only rely on thrusters to maneuver the ship in atmosphere, so they can perform pretty aggressively. With the introduction of control surfaces, you can expect ships to behave a bit more restrictive with how they fly. No longer can you just strafe up while moving forward to corkscrew and dodge fire, only to then stop to a hover and instantly fly backwards at high speeds to delta merge with an opponent like we do in space combat now with the current model. Instead, you will have to choose your flight path carefully during your engagements. For example, you could overshoot an opponent you are chasing, giving him the advantage of now being on your 6 o'clock. And since you are limited in your maneuvering options, you cannot just simply flip around on a dime and go nose to nose with him anymore. You will have to jink his incoming fire and try to turn the tables on him, either by outrating him, outrunning him, or outsmarting him. You can still flip on those smaller maps like we mentioned before, but again you run the risk of running short on fuel, overheating, and breaking those thrusters during a crucial moment, or worse, G-locking your pilot and losing all control and passing out. Risk versus reward. This will make fights in atmosphere far more compelling than it currently is now, as these changes will require pilots to think ahead when in a dogfight, and will also bring those fights closer to that World War II close-in style fighting that CIG desires for its flight model. Right now, when we currently look at ships in game, we can already see these control surfaces modeled on our ships. Some look to be quite useful, and others may have a limited effect, and some are missing almost entirely, most notably on very large ships or older ships that have not seen updates in some time. As CIG adds these new control surfaces to each ship, they will have to animate each one, and some may need to be remodeled to fit the ship's aesthetic, or to look like it actually belongs on that part of the ship. Regardless, once these new control surfaces are implemented, I suspect CIG will then tweak atmospheric flight values, making flying on a planet far more punishing if you opt to fly like how we currently do with our thrusters on at all times. After all, there is precedent for this. Way back in 3.5, CIG adjusted the values of thruster outputs, making them heat up faster and even shutting down quicker when boosting, even in space. And it had the possibility of burning out thrusters in atmospheric flight even if just cruising along, given enough time. Of course, we did not have control surfaces at the time, so the change was largely hated due to it being far too punishing and offering little in the way of mechanical interest to both space and atmospheric flight. But now, with the inclusion of control surfaces, it is not out of the realm of possibilities to see something like this return again. Now, it's unclear whether CIG would ever tune the balancing back to those old 3.5 extremes, but it's not out of the realm of possibilities that they may make thrusters weaker in terms of temperature management and wear values in the near future to make usage of control surfaces more enticing when they are implemented. Furthermore, CIG have also mentioned that temperatures on planets will also eventually affect how our ships will perform. So hotter planets could cause our thrusters to operate poorly or overheat more often, and colder planets could allow us to be a little bit more aggressive, but could have other detrimental effects, such as causing thrusters to get stuck due to ice buildup, among other things. This will naturally train players to utilize control surfaces as much as possible when operating in atmosphere and only using thrusters for very specific scenarios, such as hovering to get a better view of the surroundings, racing, engaging them in an emergency during a dogfight, or when landing. As a side note, I do think that CAG will not only consider heat and wear as a factor for thrusters in atmosphere, but also thruster output, as they have said in the past that they will also consider cutting down the tuning of thruster power when in atmosphere. So even something as light as a Gladius may not even be able to keep itself aloft just on thrusters alone like they do currently, forcing the pilot to rely on these control surfaces. But we'll have to wait and see how these tunings eventually shake out when this feature is implemented. And quite recently in the May Squadron 42 monthly report, we got another interesting development for control surfaces, where CIG mentioned that depending on the gas cloud composition you are flying in, you may experience some limited forms of drag and lift from those gas clouds while in 0G. The ship will still favor thrusters overall, of course, but this drag and lift may also benefit from some partial usage of control surfaces as well. This can potentially make dogfighting in dense gas clouds more interesting, creating tactical scenarios where pilots will need to consider their movement patterns in a more careful manner than when they operate in a pure vacuum, changing the dynamics for all ships entering and exiting the clouds. Alright, so we talked a lot about what control surfaces are and what they'll be used for, but what are the actual parameters for engaging control surfaces during a flight? We know that they're going to be utilized in atmosphere, sure, but how much control are we actually going to have over them? Well, we do know a couple things, most notably mentioned by CIG publicly through some of the recent Squadron 42 monthly reports, and one of the interesting factoids from that is that IFCS will be intelligently engaging control surfaces based on our current speed in atmosphere. So for example, the slower you go, it might start to activate more power to those maneuvering thrusters, making it easier to come to a hover or to assist with landing, and conversely, as you start to pick up speed, those control surfaces are going to take over and the power is going to be diverted away from those maneuvering thrusters. Again, this is all being tied to IFCS, so as you accelerate, it's nearly all control surfaces that are guiding the craft as you apply stick input, but if you pull really hard on the stick and start to bleed speed, IFCS may ask those thrusters to power back on, keeping you from stalling, pushing those thrusters hard while exerting high Gs on the pilot. And again, even with MAVs trying to keep you from stalling, it will slow you down, and as such, you may need to trade altitude for potential energy. Otherwise, you run the risk of burning out those MAVs, running low on fuel, and most importantly, you are now much slower, and that bandit on your 6 o'clock has an easier time picking you off. So just because IFCS can help you pull off some of those crazy stunts like we're used to now, the cost of doing so may not necessarily be worth the risk. On the subject of landings, this also does call into question the functionality of landing gears with wheels on them. In more recent promotional videos, we see ships taking off and landing from air bases that have what look to be almost traditional landing strips of today, rather than that square landing pad style that we're so used to right now. Currently in-game, landing gears with wheels operate about the same as the skid versions that most ships use currently. The wheels do not turn or operate anything like their real-life counterpart, although they do have some friction adjustments to make them slide a bit more. With the inclusion of control surfaces and the benefits of gliding like a plane coming in later, this does beg the question of when CIG plans to expand on landing gears with wheels to give them more functionality than currently, as they have said in the past that landing gears with wheels will be more functional at some point, giving those types of gear systems some altered flexibility when operating in tighter spaces or landing sites. They may also be a bit more economical since you can take off like a traditional plane, which could save you more fuel rather than the standard vertical takeoff and landing method right now currently, particularly on high gravity planets where hovering could be more punishing for ships using VTOL methods. The implementation of control surfaces will also further push the game away from a time to kill combat model like we're currently used to today, to a more time to disable style of combat. With the advent of soft death and salvage, combat now has the possibility of knocking out players and NPCs when enough HP damage is done to the ship, giving the crew the opportunity to bail from the stricken ship if they are quick enough. However, this is just a temporary stopgap, as physicalized damage modeling will make disabling of ships far more common, as the existing health pool model we have currently will be removed in favor of a ballistic penetration model that will simulate damage to components and other systems, such as control surfaces when the ship is struck by weapons fire. This means that prolonged engagements could eventually lead to damaged control surfaces, forcing the pilot to switch to maneuvering thrusters just to stay combat effective. A savvy pilot at this point would know that they are on a strict time limit, as their thrusters will be pushed hard while fighting now that the control surfaces are busted. leading either to a withdrawal from the battle or the ship being knocked out due to being at a disadvantage, thus moving away from time to kill to time to disable. And lastly, we tend to rarely spend too much time on the base planets that have normal gravity and atmosphere. So to many, they may wonder if these changes are even going to matter, since most of where the players tend to spend their time is either in space or around the moons for the most part. We sometimes get bounties or missions to move boxes on places like Hurston, ArcCorp, or Microtech, but never does anybody really spend a whole lot of extended time on these larger planets. However, with how amazing the Montreal team has been crushing it with the recent updates to Lorville and beyond, and the eventual inclusion of missions around Crusader, and the prospects of Pyro on the horizon, it's safe to say that these new control surfaces will definitely get their time to shine, and plenty of usage from the player base going forward. A lot of players are excited for the coming changes to combat in the form of master modes, but while I too am excited for this upcoming change, control surfaces have really had my eye for some time now, along with the eventual changes to the damage model. And hopefully I've both well explained and made the case for why aerodynamic control surfaces coming down the road will be quite the impressive change for such a seemingly small feature. Alright folks, that's it for me today. I hope you enjoyed my deep dive into aerodynamic control surfaces, and hopefully you now have a better understanding of what is coming to Star Citizen's not too distant future. But what are your thoughts? Do you like the way the flight behaves in atmosphere currently and think they should not even bother, or are you like me and excited to see this aspect of flight get deepened? Let me know below and let's have a chat. Big shoutouts to my org, the Forgotten Heralds, for helping me put this together. Without them, this video would not be possible, so thanks fellas. Until next time, fly safe and I'll see you all in the black.